On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 8, Fall or Rise? At the same time the Bible makes a radical distinction between man and other living beings, it interprets his humanization as a fall. Here we find the double speech I alluded to earlier. In order to surmount this apparent contradiction, Judeo-Christian monotheism is led to depict original man, man before sin, as a creature that is not the least bit real. The man who existed before the fall is not man as we know him. He is a being who is both pure spirit, who dwells in the intimacy of absolute being represented by God, but who is at the same time pure nature, who lives in total harmony with creation, at peace with the animals, and so forth. This idealization of man goes hand in hand with the idealization of nature. Adam, symbolically representing the first humans, corresponds to the prehistoric natural man, whose humanization has not yet truly come about, who is not yet a creature of culture. Not yet detached from the earth, Adama, he remains one whose activity is essentially dictated by his membership in his species. 18th century philosophers would resuscitate this vision with the myth of the noble savage. After his creation of Adam, God gave birth to Eve. We know in this regard that a certain contradiction exists between the two creation stories contained in Genesis 1:27 and 2:18-25. That is not what is important though. It can be noted, on the other hand, that the transition from the androgynous Adam, man and woman he created them, Genesis 1:27, to the Adam to whom God offered a companion, already emphasizes just how incommensurable is the distance between man and God. As long as he was alone, Adam was unique. From the moment Eve steps on the scene, this uniqueness is undone. Necessarily appearing with her are the notions of otherness, complementarity, as well as insufficiency. Eve's presence shows Adam, retrospectively, the reality of what he is lacking. This obviously sets him at odds with Yahweh, who by definition can never lack for anything. Jewish tradition, incidentally, reads the passage from Genesis that immediately precedes the appearance of the first woman. God said, "It is not good that man be alone," 2:18, as it is not good for God that man be alone. Alone, and immortal to boot, man is free to imagine that he lacks for nothing and there is nothing to distinguish him from God. He could believe himself God's equal and not merely made in his likeness. This is precisely what he must be prevented from believing. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are given the choice of living eternally in the bliss of Yahweh, sheltered from the assaults of history, the real world, and time, or to become true human beings, that is to say, to begin to travel, as they desire, the historical path that will establish them as what they are. We all know what happened. Adam and Eve surrendered to the temptation offered by the serpent. So what did this serpent say? He told Eve, "You shall be as gods who know good and evil," Genesis 3:4. In fact, the serpent has no trouble demonstrating that a freedom one cannot truly exercise is not really a freedom, that the beginning of the prohibition contained within itself the logical possibility of other prohibitions, and that the very fact of prohibition is antagonistic to the freedom God claimed to have granted them, Genesis 3:1. In this case, the exception does not confirm the rule but repudiates it. It will also be noted in passing that this serpent is polytheistic. In fact, the phrase "you shall be as gods" immediately leads to the conclusion that there may be more than one. The presence of the serpent inside the Garden of Eden raises on its own a certain number of problems and difficulties of a theological nature. Genesis describes the serpent as the most cunning of all the beasts of the field, 3:1. This is not a true serpent though, because only afterward is he condemned to crawl on his belly, Genesis 3:14. Some theologians interpret the serpent to simply represent the evil inclination that dwells in the heart of man. Adam and Eve, placed in the Garden of Eden, find themselves forbidden to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Genesis 2:17. Catholic theologians believe this knowledge forbidden by Elohim Yahweh is neither omniscience nor moral discernment, but the ability to decide what is good or evil. Jewish theology is more subtle. The tree of the knowledge is interpreted as the representation of a world where good and evil are in a combined state, where there is no absolute good and evil. In other words, the tree is a foreshadowing of the real world we live in, a world where nothing is absolutely clear-cut, where moral imperatives are tied to human values, and where everything of any greatness and importance always takes place beyond good and evil. Furthermore, in the Hebrew tradition to eat means to assimilate. To eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is therefore to personally enter this real world where human initiative combines good and evil. Adam's transgression, from which all the others are derived, is clearly that of autonomy. Accordingly, as emphasized by Eisenberg and Abecassis, this would be the desire to conduct his own history alone according to his own desire and his own word or law. Confronted by man's desire for autonomy, Yahweh displays a kind of fear, which is manifested by his establishment of a new compensatory prohibition. Behold, man has become as one of us, to know good and evil. Lest he now put forth his hand, and take also the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Genesis 3:22. What is now involved, from an obviously symbolic point of view, is to prevent man, who by transgressing the initial prohibition has successfully achieved his humanization, from attaining immortality. As long as Adam had not transgressed, the tree of life was not forbidden to him to the very extent he did not need it, for, as the Bible says, it was only his transgression that rendered him mortal, Genesis 2:17. But now man should become ephemeral. He becomes peaceful with death. Expelled from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve become the first pagans of history. Translation: they have become accomplished individuals, human beings in the full sense of the word. This humanization goes hand in hand with a true individuation. It is only after he has sinned that Adam is personally challenged by God, Genesis 3:9. The generic history of humanity begins with the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Civilization is also now able to start. Work appears. Human intelligence gives birth to syntactic language. These facts are regarded negatively in the Bible. According to the theology schools, original sin may be interpreted in rather dramatic fashion. The fact remains that if Adam and Eve had obeyed God, history would never have begun and humanity never would have been. The following episode introduces Abel, Hevel, and Cain to the scene. Time goes by and it happens that Cain presents products of the earth in offering to Yahweh, and Abel, for his part, offers the firstborn from his flocks, and even their fat. Now the Lord accepts Abel and his offering. But he did not accept Cain or his, and this vexed Cain greatly. Cain spoke to his brother Abel, "Let's go outside," and when they found themselves in the countryside, Cain hurled himself on Abel and killed him, Genesis 4:3-8. The initially obscure reasons for Yahweh's choice of Abel are clarified when the offerings from each brother are examined. Abel's murder by Cain in fact involves two different lifestyles. Abel is a nomadic shepherd, whereas Cain is a farmer, Genesis 4:2. The first extends into the new society, born of the Neolithic Revolution, a typically pre-Neolithic lifestyle. In continued loyalty to desert tradition, he has formed no attachment to any particular land. The second, Cain, is the man of the Neolithic Revolution, the revolution that allows man to more clearly assert his mastery over the world, to subjugate the world more fully as an object. As a farmer, he is by that very status rooted, attached to the soil that Yahweh has cursed because of Adam, Genesis 3:17. To borrow an expression I used earlier, he is displaying an incestuous attachment toward the earth. He has chosen, as Levinas puts it, terality as opposed to infinity, the pagan conquest of space against the Hebrew possession of time as eternity. For this attachment to a given soil, rootedness, bears within itself the warning signs of everything the Bible stigmatizes as idolatry. These include the distinct cities, patriotism, the state and reasons of state, the frontier that distinguishes citizen from foreigner, the vocation of soldier, politics, and so forth. Whereas by his sacrifice, Abel shows he keeps his spirit totally open for Yahweh, Cain's sacrifice asks God to sanctify the kind of existence that has earned God's disapproval because it is a manifestation of the increased autonomy man is seeking. Just like Adam, Cain reveals his pride, and this is why he is condemned. In fact, the principal cause of Cain's condemnation is not Abel's murder, but Cain's refusal to humble himself by repenting. Questioned by Yahweh, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain returns the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 9:4. The underlying message is that it was Yahweh's responsibility to guard him. Cain, the farmer, is condemned to wander. He is exiled to a nomadic existence, expelled back to nature for having sought to give himself a supernature. Adam had been similarly condemned for having placed himself above the law. What is involved in each incident is a pejoratively unidealized nature. Adam's transformation into a true human is accompanied by the transformation of nature into a jungle. In the case of Cain, the nomadic life is converted into exile. Cain then declares, "My punishment is too heavy to bear," Genesis 4:13. But all he means by this is that the condemnation he has been struck with is overly harsh. Pride again. Cain is in fact the preeminent civilizing hero. If we are the children of Cain, a rather exaggerated term, as Adam and Eve also engendered Seth, it is as people of culture and civilization. After his condemnation, Cain in fact founded the first city, which he named after his son Enoch, Genesis 4:17. By this same act, he doubled his transgression, first because by all evidence he was seeking to make a name for himself, next, because biblical tradition condemns vanity, by virtue of which he named a city after a person. This name Enoch is significant itself, as Ik is built on a root that means inauguration, beginning, as well as man. In other words, Cain was seeking to substitute a specifically human beginning for the absolute beginning represented by the creation. He set up his own beginning in opposition to Yahweh's and thereby profaned the notion. Cain did not restrict himself to engendering urban civilization, the one where history is made, but he also forms the first link in a long chain of inventors of civilization. One of his descendants, Jubal, was the first musician. Another, Tuval-Cain, is the ancestor of smiths, and it is to him we owe the discovery of metallurgy. In this respect he is considered to be the first specialist in the art of war, a fact that of course earns him God's personal disapproval. It is another descendant of Cain, Nimrod, the hunter, in other words the conqueror, son of Cush, to whom Genesis symbolically attributes the construction of Babylon, Nineveh, Akkad, Rehoboth, Calah, Rezin, and so forth, 10-8-12. This is certainly not by chance. Jacques Ellul, in an insightful book, furthermore, has found that the Bible lays a veritable curse on the city, as it represents the place where man is most apt to sovereignly declare his free destiny. The city, Ellul notes, is a direct consequence of Cain's murder and Cain's refusal to accept God's protection. Just as history began with the murder of Abel, civilization begins with the city and everything it represents. Again, what the city stands for is roots, territory, the frontier, power, everything that allows a man to make a name for himself. And also, of course, idolatry, because every city seeks its own protective deity. The result is a multiplicity of gods. The curse, Ellul goes on to say, is pronounced right at the start. It forms part of the town's very being, it is embedded within the framework of its history. The city is a cursed locale because of its very origin, its structure, withdrawal, its quest for gods. Every city in its own development resumes this curse and tolerates it, for it is one of the constituent elements of every city. The large city is itself a manifestation of pride. Nineveh declared itself as without equal. Zephaniah 2:15. As did Babylon, Isaiah 47:8. In Egypt the people of Israel had already been toiling to build the cities of Pitom and Ramses, Exodus 1:11. They later suffered exile in Babylon, which explains the special execration devoted to that city. In Babylon, writes Jacques Ellul, all cities are encompassed and synthesized. Ik is truly the queen of cities and the yardstick by which all other cities are measured. When the wrath of God is unleashed, it is the first to be struck. When it is struck, all other cities are struck with it. Everything said of Babylon in reality relates to all cities in their entirety. Like all cities, Babylon is the center of civilization. Commerce toils for the city, industry develops inside it, fleets ply the waves for it, it is where beauty and luxury bloom, it is where power is built. The apocalypse transformed Babylon into the famous harlot, Revelation 17:1, and the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth, 17-5. An angel makes the announcement that it will be consumed by flames. It has fallen, Babylon the Great has fallen. 14-8 and 18-2. Yahweh also condemned Nineveh, Tyre, Damascus, and Gaza, Amos 1:3-10. Jericho was destroyed in miraculous fashion. The sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were razed in the most appalling manner. The Apocalypse denounces Rome as the beast of the sea and wears upon its 7 heads, the 7 hills, blasphemous titles, Revelation, 13-1-2. It utters proud words, those who worship it will be subject to the torment of fire and brimstone, and the smoke from this torment will rise aloft for centuries upon centuries, 14:10-11. In Numbers, 21-2, it is considered a good and salutary work to condemn cities as taboo. In Hebrew, the masculine substantive meaning city also means enemy in the spiritual sense. This enemy would be the omnipotence of mankind. On every occasion the defeat of the cities represents the humiliation of the great and the degradation of the powerful. The prophets always set their sights upon the cities with incredible persistence and consistency, writes Ellul again. There is an abundance of such texts, and whether the cities are friends or enemies, the judgment remains the same. If there is any strict concurrence among the prophets it would certainly be on this point. But it is God's judgment. In other words, it is a matter between God and the city. To truly understand the history of cities, this curse that weighs heavily upon them must be taken into account. A curse that, from one end of the scriptures to the other, is expressed in the words, "I will destroy," said the Lord. Only Jerusalem is an exception to this rule. That is because it is to other cities what the land of Israel is to other lands, their proportional antithesis. Jerusalem is not a sacred city but a holy city. It is a unique city, of a kind seen nowhere else. It is the city that will one day absorb all the rest. In some ways it is the anti-city. This makes man God's golem. This is an old tale, Frankenstein, of the creature who rebels against his creator. At the end of the first part of Genesis, Yahweh's trepidation with respect to the way man used his freedom, and his anger and jealousy were so strong that he purely and simply decided to commit genocide against humanity. The Lord regretted having made mankind upon the earth and felt a great pain in his heart. And Yahweh said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the men I have created, Genesis 6:6-7. This is the episode of the deluge from which only Noah and his family out of all humanity escaped. This led into a new beginning in which Yahweh established his covenant with Noah. But unfortunately for Yahweh, humanity was not always disposed to submit to his will. One more step forward in the establishment of civilization was made with the construction of the Tower of Babel. Having moved east, mankind exclaimed, Come! Let us build a city and a tower whose spire will penetrate the heavens. Let us make ourselves one in name and not be dispersed throughout the earth. Genesis 11:4. Before this new display of pride, Yahweh immediately expressed his wrath. Now there is no design that they cannot realize. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they can no longer understand one another. Genesis 11:6-7. The nature of the transgression committed by the builders of the tower is obvious. Furthermore, it is still the same one. It is the autonomy of man, his creative and Promethean power that God senses in some way in the Babel undertaking, writes André Neyer. The idea at work behind this undertaking, specifies Ernst Bloch, is connected by his desire to create like God, following the advice of the serpent, thus to the desire to become and be like God. Other authors have also incorporated the Tower of Babel into the historic model of the West. What is interesting, moreover, is that the diversification of humanity into peoples possessing different languages and cultures is presented here as Yahweh's riposte to human audacity. The fundamental good of cultural variety is therefore allegedly derived from a transgression exactly as the entrance into history was the result of Adam's transgression. It is tacitly understood that idolatry appears simultaneously with the formation of nations, remarks Nawum M. Sama. The Tower of Babel should therefore be considered as the first of these idols and the story of its construction as the sequel to the Anu-Pagan polemics contained within the earlier stories of the creation and the deluge. The Jehovahist has a kind of hatred for civilization, Emist Renan wrote. Every step forward on the path of what we call progress is a crime in his eyes, to be swiftly followed by a punishment. The punishment for civilization is work and the division of humanity. The attempt of the worldly, profane, monumental, artistic culture of Babel is the preeminent crime. From the perspective of the Bible, everything transpires as if every effort by man to grow has the consequence of diminishing Yahweh. Man, we know, has the right to make but he does not have the right to create. Every stage of human creation is a profanation. The cost of its victory is retreat from God. In comparison to Abel, Abraham, Jacob, Adam, Cain, Enoch, Nimrod, Esau, and so on, stand out as civilizers. Now Yahweh has nothing but hatred for brickmakers, for a humanity still drawn to declaring, let us make a name for ourselves. Nislanu Kem. In order to manifest this hatred and put it to work in a concrete manner, Judeo-Christian monotheism instituted it into a system. The historic role of Abraham, the nomad exiled from the city of Ur, was to challenge, from the very interior of the world, this civilization born of the Neolithic Revolution by means of a series of revolts against Yahweh. The first act by which Abraham became the father of a nation, notes Hegel, is a scission that tears apart the bonds of everyday life and love, every relationship he had experienced until that time with man and nature, all those fine relations of youth he cast aside. In this sense Abraham's solemn yes to Yahweh, Genesis 22:2-11, is first a no to human autonomy, a no to history, a no called upon to transform into the Ewigen Nein of which Goethe speaks. The rupture symbolized by Abraham is a rupture with the historic becoming of a humanity spontaneously carried to a superhumanity. It displays the idea that at the end of time all peoples and nations will share his refusal and renounce their own destinies. After Abraham, Moses repeats this commitment. Just as the people of Israel were able to escape captivity in Egypt, the whole of humanity is called upon to escape from the captivity of history. The law of Yahweh, formulated on Mount Sinai, is presented as the means of rescinding once and for all Adam and Eve's transgression. This is the role of Judeo-Christian monotheism, to definitively forbid man any present pregnant with a future that did not depend on this monotheism, ad infinitum. Nietzsche believed he could identify in monotheism's origins the trace of an old personality change, the imprint of a compensation for a feeling of inferiority. So as not to lose face, someone who cannot do something claims that he does not want to do it, or that to want to do it is evil. The same is true in Judeo-Christianity, to the extent that everything strong and great is viewed by man as superhuman, as alien to himself. Man diminishes, he divides between two spheres as two aspects, one pitiable and weak, the other strong and gripping, The first sphere he calls man, the second Ged. The ideal can always be seen, but it is seen as inaccessible and thereon transferred to an equally unattainable God. The invention of an absolute superiority will tend to justify a relative inferiority. Everything the believer places under the idea of God is in fact pilfered from man himself, as if through a series of communicating vessels. Everything then takes place as if God's greatness was only the repression of neurotic man. Here the system and its discourse begin to obey their own logic. The man who becomes alienated from his own freedom because he is incapable of making full use of it and places it, in a desire for compensation, in the power of a single and remote God, accepts in advance the very principle of his mutilation. It is because he feels subjugated that he transforms this submission into intentional servitude, through the angle of a covenant with a master who holds the omnipotence he does not. By so doing, he condemns himself to eternal suffering, but he makes this suffering the very justification of his existence, and of his critical attitude toward the world. A similar arrangement can be found in Marx's concept of social alienation that will itself produce the realization that will terminate it. In both cases, liberation is tied to man's capacity for suffering and reinterpreting his suffering. Finally he dissimulates, not unskillfully, the subjective nature of his approach behind the affirmation that seems as objective as it could possibly be, of an absolute being who created the world. In such a way that we had to wait for Nietzsche to raise the essential questions: who is talking? What are his true intentions? And what are the results of this speech? In paganism, of course, no one asks the gods to exchange the slavery of some for a guarantee of the slavery of all. This is because the gods of paganism do not consider men to be their rivals. The great deeds of human beings not only aggrandize humans but also aggrandize the gods. Human undertakings are not an assault against divine qualities, on the contrary, they bear witness to those qualities. Far from men being forbidden to make a name for themselves, that is the very thing that justifies their existence and earns them a piece of eternity. This is what is declared in one of the more famous maxims from the Edda: men die, as do beasts, but the sole thing that does not die is the renown of a noble name. Whereas the Bible displays its intention of limiting human sovereignty by a series of prohibitions, which forecasts the modern theory of countervailing powers, the religions of ancient Europe gave heroic dimensions to the man who exceeded his abilities and thereby shared in the divine. Where the scriptures look at life with a blend of distrust and trepidation, paganism hypostatizes in its beliefs all the ardor, intensity, and pulsation of life. Instead of pushing man to exceed himself, the monotheism of the Bible consumes his vitality. He must impoverish and annihilate himself to give consistency to God. The deity becomes a kind of hemorrhaging of human nature. And God manipulates the transfusion of all man's creative energies. Power, in the best of cases, is merely a stopgap. The world as we know it is only a stopgap. History is a stopgap. Man himself is a stopgap. From his own viewpoint it would have been better if he never existed. According to the Talmud, for the space of 3 years the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai debated to learn what was better for mankind, to have been created or not. A vote was taken and the result was, it would have been better if he had not been created. But now that he is here, he should scrupulously examine his actions. This negative nature of monotheism appears again, in an extreme form, in the theory of Tzimtzum, contraction, introduced in the 16th century by the Kabbalist Isaac Luria, according to whom the world emerged in the absolute void when God withdrew into himself in order to make a place for it. The reason for existence would then be that God wished to see God. Withdrawn from a place, the contracted absolute everything opened up a void in which the mirror of existence could appear. The whole of objectified creation, separated from the world of emanation, would have thus been born from a concept of the negative. The transcendent God is then called in, no thing, pushed to extremes. This kind of representation would culminate in the opinion of Bernard-Henri Lévy, according to whom the history of God's people was an eternal naysaying stubbornness. It can also be noted that, with the exception of 2, all the 10 commandments are expressed in the negative. On the other hand, Meister Eckhart interprets the phrase from Exodus, I am that I am, as the purity of the affirmation, as all negation is excluded from God himself. The Christian conception of God, writes Nietzsche again, is one of the most corrupt conceptions of God arrived at on earth. Perhaps it even represents the low water mark in the descending development of the God type. God degenerated to the contradiction of life, instead of being its transfiguration and eternal yes. In God a declaration of hostility towards life, nature, the will to life. God the formula for every calumny of this world, for every lie about the next world. Judeo-Christian monotheism developed a negative anthropology because it is a negative religion. An ant religion.